unaccountabilitystories.com.
We're here in Ruby Ridge, Idaho. We're about 40 miles south of the Canadian border. Let me give you some background. There was a guy named Randy Weaver who met his future wife named Vicky while living in Iowa. He later left and was active in the Green Berets in Vietnam, and soon after returning they basically decided that they wanted to move away from the world which they saw as corrupt. They wanted to homeschool their children, and they packed up and left. In January of '83 they ended up in this area of Idaho. A year later, in January of '84, the Weavers bought a piece of property here on Ruby Ridge. They bought 20 acres for $5 grand. Later that year, Randy Weaver had a property dispute with one of his neighbors. The Weaver was in the right. The neighbor basically had it out for Randy Weaver. He sent some letters to some federal agencies claiming that Weaver was essentially out to get the feds. Based on these letters that Randy Weaver's neighbors sent to the feds, Randy Weaver and his wife Vicky met with some FBI agents, Secret Service agents, and the sheriff here from the Boundary County and his chief investigator. The Weavers denied doing anything illicit. The Secret Service pressed Randy Weaver on him being a member of the Aryan Nations, which Randy Weaver denied. He did admit, though, to having a mutual friend who was friends with some folks in the Aryan Nations. About 3 years later, in 1986, Randy Weaver attended an informational meeting about the Aryan Nations with his friend, and there he met a ATF informant. This guy had been arrested of basically trafficking guns, cut a deal with the ATF, was working for them, was undercover with the Aryan Nations, and over the next few years, him and Randy Weaver had some contacts, and eventually he pressured Randy Weaver into selling him a couple shotguns. Randy Weaver claims that the shotguns he sold for $300 total were illegal when he gave them to this informant, but the ATF claims that the shotguns that Weaver sold the informant were in fact shorter than the federal law stated they could be, and a quarter of an inch too short. The ATF soon approached Randy Weaver, asked him to be an informant on the Aryan Nations. They told him they had conversations with Weaver, recorded that essentially proved he was involved in some wrongdoing, and they threatened to seize his truck if he didn't cooperate. Randy Weaver refused. He basically said, "Just leave me alone, I'm not interested in any of this." So right away the feds filed some firearms charges against Randy Weaver. 3 months later, Weaver was convicted by a federal grand jury of making and possessing illegal firearms, but not for selling them. Fast forward to January 17th of '91, and the feds had continued to have the Weavers under surveillance. They had been paying a neighbor to inform them of coming and goings of vehicles to the property, of license plates, and when the Weavers did leave their property. So at one point, when the feds received notice that the Weavers were leaving their property to go into town, they essentially set up a roadblock. They posed as broke down motorists. They had previously observed the Weavers helping such people. They basically posed as broken down motorists on this one-lane bridge. When the Weavers pulled over to stop and Randy put his head inside the vehicle's engine compartment to see what was going on, the feds stuck a .45 handgun in the back of his neck. A bunch of other feds came out of the camper that was on the truck, surrounded them, threw Vicky Weaver down in the snow and mud, and she was not arrested. Randy Weaver was arrested, but he was, after he was told of his charges that he faced at a court date, he was released on bail. 5 days later, two things happened. Weaver was assigned a court-appointed attorney named Hoffmeister, and Weaver called the U.S. Probation Office and asked when his court date was. The person he spoke to didn't have that information in front of him, asked for Weaver's contact info, and told him he would get back to him with that information. He claims that Weaver only provided a mailing address, not a phone number, and eventually when the information was sent out, the incorrect date for the court, for the trial was listed. A local reporter saw the discrepancy in the date that Weaver had been sent and the actual date of the court, that he called the judge and the area law enforcement and told them of this, but still the judge refused to lift the bench warrant for Weaver's arrest. But they did agree to let Weaver turn himself in before the March 20th court date. In that time, though, on March 14th, the U.S. Attorney's Office held essentially a grand jury. They told them of Weaver's actions, but they did not inform the grand jury that Weaver had been told the incorrect court date. So based on this purposefully misinformation, the grand jury issued an indictment. For the next 16 months, the U.S. Marshals had Weaver under surveillance. They did aerial photography and reconnaissance with planes and helicopters. They tapped phones in the areas of neighbors and general store. They recorded the Weavers' coming and goings. And on August 21st of 1992, 6 marshals dressed in camo went onto his property ostensibly to determine locations where they could easily ambush the Weavers as they were leaving their property. 3 of the agents stayed behind as doing observations. 3 of the agents went ahead closer to the property. One of them threw 2 rocks towards the Weavers' dogs to try to gauge their reactions to noise and people on the property. But one of the dogs, Striker, a yellow lab retriever, followed the sound. The agents initially fell back, but then took defensive positions. Out on the property at the time was Randy Weaver, his son Sammy, who was 14, and a family friend named Kyle Harris, who's 25, who had been living with the Weavers. They didn't have any meat, and they were out on a hunt, so they thought maybe the dog had triggered to a deer. So Sammy and Kyle followed Striker down one trail, while Randy Weaver ran down a different trail to what's essentially a Y. At that Y is where the 3 federal agents, 3 marshals were. Randy Weaver showed up first, realized they were federal agents. One of them, supposedly, he says he identified himself. Randy Weaver swore, turned around, ran back to the cabin, yelled to Sammy and Kyle to get back, that it was an ambush. But about that time, Sammy and Kyle came around the corner